Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I am Wendy Penn, NAR's Housing Opportunity Program Manager. I have just a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. We muted your microphone upon entry and ask that you stop your video as well for the duration of the presentation. Feel free to utilize the chat function to ask questions during the presentation, or raise your hand at the end of the session to chat with our presenters directly. Our moderator will unmute you. Today's presentation is being recorded. You will find the playback link on the website you used to register for the webinar within the next 2 days. We will also post a recording of the session on the Realtor Party website. If you hear something today that you want to share on social media, please be sure to tag us. We will post our social media handles and hashtag in the chat box. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Zeke Morris, NAR's 2020 Realtor Party Community Engagement Liaison, who will formally welcome you to today's webinar. Zeke? Zeke, I don't think you're unmuted.
There we go. All right, let's try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zeke Morris, your 2020 Realtor Party Community Engagement Liaison. Welcome to Market Fundamentals to address property vacancy and abandonment. This is the first webinar in our 4-part series, Stabilizing and Revitalizing Neighborhoods in the COVID-19 Era. This series is part of NAR's Transforming Neighborhoods Through program, which we offer in partnership with the Center for Community Progress. Transforming Neighborhoods provides realtors with the opportunity to learn alongside local partners about underlying factors that keep vacant and abandoned, deteriorated properties stuck in decline, and explores ways to bring these properties back to productive use to creative, vibrant, and equitable communities. I'm pleased to see so many realtors, association staff, and community partners join the webinar today. We all know the issue associated with vacancy and abandonment predates COVID-19. However, the coronavirus pandemic has brought new attention to these challenges. The good news is that this challenge comes with the opportunity to strengthen partnerships and examine how we can build more equitable and resilient communities. Now is the time for realtors, local government, and other stakeholders to develop strategies to navigate the efforts of COVID-19. Our webinar series begins with today's presentation. Will provide you with insights and practical tools that you can use in your communities. Our speakers today are Danielle Lewinsky and Veronica Cardillo. First, we'll hear from Danielle Lewinsky, Vice President and Director of Michigan Initiatives for the Center for Community Progress. In her role, Danielle directs the organization's technical assistance, leadership and education, research and policy work throughout Michigan. Before joining Community Progress, Danielle worked as the Director of Planning and Technical Programs for Michigan Community Resources, where she created and executed the planning and technical assistance offerings of the Detroit Vacant Property Campaign, including strategy development, data analysis, and mapping services aimed at helping communities address vacancy, blight, and abandonment. After Danielle talks with you about identifying and analyzing market challenges and opportunities as a part of our strategy for addressing vacancy and abandonment, Veronica Cardillo will share how her associations are putting theory into practice. Veronica Cardillo is in the Southwestern Field Representative for Pennsylvania Association of Realtors. Her territory covers over 6 associations, 2,240 members, and 503 municipalities. Veronica aids her association in promoting regional planning, growing grassroots efforts, engaging in legislative affairs, RPAC fundraising, advancing communication and media coordination, as well as creating partnerships between local associations, local government officials, nonprofit organizations, and for-profit organizations to promote private property rights. Thank you again for joining us today. And now I'll turn things over to Danielle.
Great, thank you. So for today's presentation, I'm going to stop my video so that you can see the screen a bit better, and I'm going to flip to that right now. All right. So a couple of notes I just wanted to offer as we get started, a little bit more about the Center for Community Progress in my organization. So Center for Community Progress, we are a national nonprofit organization, and our core focus as an organization is to help foster strong, equitable communities. Ultimately, we're trying to make sure that vacant and deteriorated properties are transformed into assets for neighbors and neighborhoods. So our core focus is really on the topic of vacant and problem properties. That will be the whole topic area today. Couple of notes just on the type of services that we provide and our reach. We provide technical assistance. We also do a lot of education and training, like today's conversation. Our focus, though, is less so on sort of what to do with a single vacant property, more so how can we change the systems that are impacting and fostering those vacant and abandoned properties. Since 2010, we've served over 250 communities across the US. We've reached thousands through our educational events and our conferences, and we've distributed a lot of publications, some of which I'll reference on our call today. So what I was thinking we could do related to the topic of markets and data, understanding these properties and understanding solutions, is focus on 4 general topic areas. First is really taking a step back to talk about what are problem properties, what is problematic vacancy, then go into a conversation about how to address and prevent problem properties. And there, what I will do is give you sort of an overarching view. I'm not going to delve too deeply into sort of single tools like land banks or code enforcement. We will be offering future webinars through our partnership with NAR, where you can learn more about some of those issues, or excuse me, tools if you're interested. Then the second half, I'm going to talk about how to sort of determine which of those tools, strategies, or tactics may be most helpful. And the answer to that, I'll give you a preview, is data and information. When I'm speaking largely with a governmental audience, what I'll do is talk at length about why housing markets matter and markets generally. I'll talk a lot about supply and demand and pricing. Given the audience today, I'm really going to swiftly walk through some of that and reference some of the pieces on market. Where I will spend more time is talking about data sources. Realtors have access to a lot of data. I want to make sure that I'm highlighting other questions that you may want to answer through your work to address vacant properties, and also how to get some of those data and what some of the partnership opportunities could look like. So first off, what I wanted to do is understand who's in the room a bit more. So I am used to talking to people in a room. The adaptation to a webinar is still a little bit odd to me, so I like to understand sort of who's on the other side of my computer. What I wanted to know is first the types of communities that you serve. So what I'm going to do is launch a poll. You should receive it right now. And could you answer the community that you serve? Is it rural? Would you consider it to be suburban? Would you consider it to be urban, or other? And what I'll do is I'll give you a couple of seconds to answer this question, and then I'll show you the results. You'll see me do this sort of throughout, just as checkpoints for the presentation. So I'm gonna give it just one more second. Okay. So it looks like the majority of attendees today are reflecting suburban communities. Next up would be urban, and then followed by rural communities and other. So that's helpful for me to know. We still have a mix on the conversation today. I will do my best to reference vacancy challenge in urban, rural, and suburban. I encourage you, if I haven't quite met the needs that or spoken to the needs your community is facing, when we go into Q&A later, please do ask me some specific questions. So, jumping in to our first topic of understanding problem properties. First, vacant properties generally, I like to take a step back and just reiterate, vacancy in of itself is not a bad thing. You guys know, as realtors, any healthy market must have vacant properties so people can move in and out. However, there's a point at which the scale and the nature of that vacancy becomes problematic. Typically, what we look at is when a property's condition or the occupancy harms a community and its people, that's when it becomes problematic. We also tend to look at scale. So when it is pervasive, when it is concentrated, when it seems really entrenched, it can have an absolutely devastating effect on residents' health, their quality of life, diminishes the value of nearby properties, harms individual wealth and also community wealth, and it has a lot of fiscal burdens for an individual city. All of those impacts of vacancy and property deterioration are well evidenced at this point by research. So let's take a look first at how vacancy generally is trending nationally. What this is showing is from about the 60s all the way through 2016, how residential specifically vacancy has trended. The orange line is showing rental vacancy, the blue is showing homeowner vacancy. As you can see, this vacancy generally across the US is notched up slowly. We see a bit of increase in the 2000s after some overbuilding and then obviously the recession. You can also see how vacancy has trended with our historic recessions. Just a note generally about vacancy levels. There's no magic number of when vacancy starts to become problematic, but here are some general thresholds that we look at. Nationally, vacancy is still at what you would consider to be a reasonable level, but as you know, when you delve into specific communities, it becomes far more problematic. Vacancy, property abandonment, property deterioration are often considered urban problems. They are not, though. At 18%, rural areas and small towns actually have a vacancy rate nearly double that of metropolitan areas nationally. Metro areas are typically closer to around 10%, so with rural and small town being at 18%, it's dramatically higher. That can be for a number of reasons that I won't get into today, but certainly it cannot all be accounted for things like second homes, vacation properties, things of that nature. That abandonment in rural communities, it's often less visible, and you could consider it to be lower in terms of harms on the community. So in terms of visibility, you don't see it. It's not as visible because it's further back typically on properties. Also, it's spread out throughout a community. So the impact on neighboring properties sometimes can be more minimal than in urban and suburban environments. But that vacancy still does have a pretty dramatic impact, particularly on municipal finance for rural communities, and still needs to be addressed. Looking at more recent trends, the number of vacant units, so that's what this blue line is showing, rose sharply after 2005 from, this is 9.5 million units to about 12 million. We declined a bit, went up a little bit more. Around 2016, it landed at about 11.2 million units that were vacant nationally. Because I'm not able to look at each one of your individual communities, that's typically what I would do in a presentation. I wanted to understand through another poll how you think, let's see here. Oops, hang on one second. How do you think vacancy is changing in your community? So hang on 1 second, stop share results. Okay, So the poll should be active for now. The question for you guys is, in the community that you're serving, do you think that property vacancy or deterioration is increasing, decreasing, remaining the same, or you're not really sure? Give you a couple more seconds. All right. So it looks like it's a bit of a mixed bag. We have about the same amount that says is increasing as is decreasing, and the winner overall is about remaining the same, with some people not quite sure, which is totally fine. The big question, though, as we think about vacancy trends generally, is what will happen as a result of COVID-19, and how long will that impact last within a community, and what will those impacts look like? So again, just wanted to get a sense from you guys through this next poll. What impact do you think COVID-19 will have? My question is basically, do you think it'll be a short-term impact? So maybe we'll see some instability in your area within just about the next year, and then we'll recover. Do you think it will be midterm? So it'll take 2 to 5 years maybe for us to sort of get back? Or do you think it could be potentially long-term, which I'm calling just here over 5 years? Or maybe it'll have no impact that you're seeing really in your community or you anticipate. Okay. So what we saw is everyone, let's see here, there seemed to be a majority around midterm, which I think is probably about right for some of the communities that I've been working with. Feeling like maybe it's more than a year, maybe as many as 5, potentially longer term. There are a fair amount of you, though, that are hoping and anticipating that this could be resolved sort of in the short term in terms of community stability. So I did want to talk about COVID for a second before I get a bit into responses to property vacancy and abandonment. This map, or graph rather, on the left is showing unemployment rates. So we know that at the peak of the Great Recession, national unemployment rates were about 10%. And if you recall that earlier graph I showed, we also show an increase in vacancy around that time as well. Thankfully, that unemployment was decreasing. In 2020, it was about 3.5%. Then, related to COVID, it shot up dramatically and seemingly overnight. In May, the national official unemployment was closer to 15%, with an estimated real unemployment of maybe about 25%. So even in May, with our official count, it was still higher than at the peak of the Great Recession. So how does unemployment link up to vacancy and property deterioration? Rolling through some of what we would be looking for, and we'd be trying to find data to understand whether or not this sort of trajectory of events is happening. When businesses lose income, when households lose income, typically they stop making property improvements. They will defer maintenance. Rents, mortgages, property taxes are not paid as other more urgent bills get paid first. Debt increases, both business debt and household debt. Evictions can occur, again, for businesses or residences. Then properties are foreclosed for non-payment of their mortgages or property taxes. As a result of those activities, what we tend to see when that happens is sales slow, leases slow or decline, property values decline, deterioration grows, and vacancy increases. These are impacts that realtors are certainly familiar with. What we then look at is how that could impact the municipality. So property tax revenue declines because property values and sales have slowed. There are also more public property costs. So things like mowing of grass, boarding up properties, more properties transition because of tax foreclosure to public ownership. As all of that occurs, we also see municipal deficits increasing. And a note here as compared to a little bit of the Great Recession. So we certainly are concerned about a decrease in property values and the impact that would have on a local government's ability to provide services. But COVID could have a more dramatic impact in other revenue sources. For some communities, Property tax revenue is actually not the largest revenue source. It's typically sales or income taxes, also gaming or hotel taxes or other taxes. All of those have declined very swiftly through COVID, and questions are still out there about how long that will last. So if that does occur, then bonds that are already out for municipalities can't be repaid, or they can't issue new bonds for services, and services will be drastically diminished to try and account for the loss of revenue. All of that ultimately results in pretty profound quality of life deterioration and inequitable impacts on most vulnerable communities, typically communities of color and low-income communities. So that's what potentially could happen. That's what's on CCP's mind. Certainly, we're interested in ways that we can prevent that flow from happening. The good news is, as opposed to sort of Great Recession, we are seeing more swift, proactive actions. So providing financial resources to businesses, to individuals to hopefully stem any future loss of property. But if this unemployment continues, and if it is longer term, some of the tactics that are in place right now won't sort of forestall the inevitable, which is potential property loss. The other thing that we're interested in looking at now, as opposed to some of what happened in the Great Recession, is the shift in consumer access to goods and services, and also how people work. So even if jobs come back, I wonder if these changes will lead to lasting market changes. So for example, if more people are working from home, will we see a decline in demand for office space? If more people prefer to shop remotely now, will we see a decline in retail space demand? The Great Recession really didn't sort of as significantly and sharply overnight alter consumer habits and office needs in a way that COVID could not. It could be that we resume patterns, or it could be that there is a more lasting change that ultimately will shift what demand looks like, and we may end up with an oversupply of properties in a way that we didn't really see through the Great Recession. And specifically, again, I'm talking about office and commercial. Okay, so back to vacant properties generally. What sort of drives that shift from a vacant property that is not harming a community to a problematic property? Ultimately, it's an imbalance between supply and demand. That's really the driving factor behind it. Again, I will go through this quickly. Realtors understand sort of what happens with supply and demand in the market, but basically if there are too few buyers for the supply of properties, that drives prices down. That removes the financial incentive to maintain a property. It makes financing for improvements nearly impossible, which that graph below is showing, because you have a gap in between the cost of repair for a property and the value of that property in the end. All of that leads to less reinvestment, more deterioration, greater abandonment, which leads to too few buyers, and this cycle sort of just keeps on churning. Another factor that impacts that imbalance between supply and demand are inefficient, ineffective, and inequitable policies. So for example, if we have a delinquent property tax enforcement system where you have a property owner that's not paid their property taxes, has no interest in redeeming their property, but that property, because of the policy approach and the laws in a community, lingers on the market sort of in this transitional space for years, that's a pretty ineffective and inefficient policy approach. There are a number of inequitable policy decisions that we've made across the US through the years that has limited access to financing to try and rebalance supply and demand in areas, many of those decisions based on things like race. But also inequitable approaches to using tools like code enforcement. So continuously leaning a property when it's a low-income elderly owner that has no physical nor financial ability to pay their property, or excuse me, bring their property up to code. So how can we sort of right that ship? How can we fix that imbalance between supply and demand? We need to use strategies, tools, and tactics. Again, I will, in the interest of sort of our time today, I'm not going to go too in depth, but just wanted to give you sort of that 30,000 level view of what a systematic approach to addressing property vacancy and deterioration looks like, and where some of the tools you hear referenced sort of land within that. First up, we want to make sure that if you own a property, that you are compelled or incentivized to fix that property up, reoccupy that property. And there's a whole host of tools local governments and local communities can use to address that. Things like code enforcement, rental property regulation, property taxes generally, and also property tax enforcement, repair incentives. If the current owner will not fix up their property, will not reoccupy their property, that's really when we look at tools to transition that property to a productive owner. So that could be something like property tax enforcement or code lien foreclosure, receivership, nuisance abatement. It also could be the public entity, whether that's a city, county, a municipality, or a special entity like a land bank, taking ownership to that property. When that occurs, we're sort of in that second bubble of potential strategies and tools. What we'll look at there is if a public entity does take ownership of the property, the question is really how can they transition it to make sure that that property is adding value to a community. In the meantime, they will take action to clean up that property in many instances. Sometimes they'll strategically hold a property. So they won't put it back on the private market because they want to assemble more parcels for a developable parcel, or because they want to direct it to a specific use. Let's say you have a greenway in the community and a public entity has the opportunity to get access to a property. They may want to hold that property until they can transition it to a nonprofit to manage that greenway space. Then finally, the last one is planning and reuse. So it's not just enough to sort of sell public properties or transition from one owner to a next. The biggest question is, what is that future use of that property? And that's where we see the second bubble. So tools like long-term planning, market building tools are really critical here. So creative placemaking, neighborhood marketing generally, infill development, rehab and purchase incentives come into play here as well. Ultimately, when we have a community with not one or two problem properties, when we're really talking about sort of entrenched vacancy, whether that's in a neighborhood or if that's across the community, what we need to see in order to effectively address and most importantly, prevent future problem properties is we need to see all three of these strategies happening. If all we're doing is code enforcement, we're not really shifting that imbalance between supply and demand. It necessitates this strategic approach. One other note here, there are a number of ways that these tools and the tactics that are used can be deployed in sort of a helpful or less helpful or more harmful way. What we look at is in each one of these, how can that strategy or that tool be efficient, be effective, and be equitable. So we want to make sure that we're deploying them in a way that will actually work for that property and that will not adversely harm any one population. Again, if you're interested in learning more about things like land banks and code enforcement, I encourage you to join us in our future webinars where we'll go super in depth on some specific tools. Before I jump to data, I did want to just reference quickly some different tactics to strengthen demand. So the tactics that I'm listing here fall within each one of those bubbles, but wanted to reference sort of just generally if you're looking for a few ideas for your community. So if you're looking to increase the desirability of that housing stock, things like transformative redevelopment projects, new construction, rehab or reconfiguration of existing stock, adaptive reuse of non-residential structures, so reusing an old school building for housing or reusing light industrial properties for live workspaces, some of that. In addition, targeting neighborhood marketing and promotion, increasing really realtor engagement for a community, helping realtors to understand and working with realtors to uplift some of the assets within a community, to be aware of what's going on in a community, and to be able to better inform potential purchasers. Neighborhood stability, number of tactics here. These are aimed at making sure that sort of the physical fabric is more stable. So foreclosure prevention, targeted code enforcement, home purchase and repair incentives, landlord repair incentives, which are often overlooked, but especially in weaker markets are quite needed. And then there are overall tactics to try and increase neighborhood quality of life. These also should be looked at. It's not simply about sort of demolishing a property or using a code enforcement tool here or there. It's also about how to make sure that that area is offering a competitive quality of life. So looking at vacant lot maintenance and reuse, community beautification and cleanups, programming and improvement of open space and parks, more and multimodal transit opportunities and options, more neighborhood serving retail. So those are all of the elements that can also help shift a market, but not all of them are sort of specifically quote unquote vacant property interventions. And I know that Veronica in her talk will reference a couple of these points. So I've just described sort of the general suite, if you will, of strategies and tools and tactics a community can use to address and prevent problem properties. But in order to determine which may be most successful and how those strategies, tools, and tactics should be applied, a community needs data. Just wanted to highlight sort of a couple of examples here of why that's the case. So if we take the house on the left, pretty clear it's a problem property, right? There are open points of entry, it's unmaintained. So what do we do about that property? Should we use code enforcement? Should we demolish it? Should we get it rehabbed? We can't possibly know what the appropriate path is for that property without more information. We know it's vacant, but who owns this property? So let's say it's privately owned. Maybe we should use code enforcement to issue daily fines of $1,000 until the property owner fixes this property up. Well, if the area that this property is sitting in, the average market value is 60 grand, current market value of the home as is 15,000, but repair costs to get it up to code are 75,000 because you need major systems, et cetera. As you all know, and as I referenced before, no bank is going to lend to that property owner. They're not going to lend more money than what the property is ultimately worth. So if our only tactic for this property is issuing fines and placing liens on the property, we're just going to increase the cost of repair. We just made it less likely that that home will ever be rehabbed. Now, sort of using that same logic, this neighborhood on the right, there are some clear signs of vacancy. We can see from the aerial that there are vacant lots, so sort of down here, also throughout. Let's assume that 25% of these houses, because you can't really tell from an aerial, let's assume they're vacant. So what tools should we use in this neighborhood? Should we have an aggressive code enforcement and demolition strategy? Maybe this is the area where we direct home repair grants. Maybe we think about a property tax incentive here. Let's say a quarter of all these properties are owned by a land bank authority. Should that land bank repair the homes before they try to sell them? Should they list them individually and as is on the private market? Should they issue a bid for a bundle of properties or an RFP to try and find a developer for them? What about the vacant land? Should they work with a nonprofit to convert them into community gardens or maybe rain gardens? Should they be sold for infill development? And then if it's infill development, should it be single family? Or should we try to increase density through duplexes or townhome development? Obviously the answer is, I don't know. You can't know. So even though I've told you how many vacant properties there are, what their condition is, who owns them, I'm still missing two very critical pieces of information to help us determine which strategies, tactics, and tools to use. I need to know what is the market context and what is the future land use vision. So let's say the street just to the south of this image, so over here, is a major thoroughfare, and it's going to get a new stop for BRT or light rail. So if I'm the land bank, I likely want to hold on to the lots and structures that I own strategically and also intentionally acquire more, so that I've assembled a large enough parcel for mixed use or multifamily development, because I want to increase density by this major transit corridor. Or let's say this area instead is immediately adjacent to heavy industry and it floods every single time there's a major rain event. Maybe instead I want to hold the properties, but for strategic acquisition, and convert this area to more of a naturalized space. So no longer a primarily residential space because it's right next to major industry, and we want to expand our industrial footprint in the area. We want to make sure instead that the vacant properties are used for groundwater infiltration, that we have more trees here to try and reduce air pollution and create sort of a natural buffer around the heavy industry. So in order to identify which may be the most successful tools and how those tools should be deployed, whether we're talking about an individual property level or sort of that neighborhood level, we need to answer 3 questions. Where are the problem properties? What is the market context? And what is the future land use vision? So starting first, and I have another poll for you. I'm wondering, for each one of your communities, does your community that you serve have a map of problem properties? Yes, no, you have no clue. Give you a couple more seconds. All right. So it looks like we don't really know, which is great, because both for that and the no's in the room, I'll identify a couple of data sources that you can use. For the yeses, excellent. I'll roll through a couple of places that you can look. Maybe it can enhance your understanding of current vacancy. All right. So in terms of data, we want to collect data to answer a couple of key questions. How many vacant structures, lots, or deteriorated structures exist? Where are they located? Are they clustered in an area? Are they scattered all over? Are they increasing or decreasing? Who owns these properties? How did they come to be vacant? Is it through tax foreclosure? Is it through another method? In what condition are they in? What we definitely want sort of snapshots of data for each one of these, but importantly, we want to examine trends. How are things changing over time, and spatial patterns. Local data sources are definitely the best source of information to answer some of those questions. It's often more up to date and more accurate than national data sets. And local data sets and sources are typically available at the parcel level, which is critical when trying to answer the question of where problem properties are located. So I have a couple of data sources listed here. Each community houses this information in slightly different places, or it may be called something slightly different, but generally speaking, the local tax assessor should have information on structural property vacancy. So is there a structure on a lot? Is there not? Is that structure vacant or not? Ownership, tenure type. So is it an owner occupied property or a renter occupied property? Also, they have information on tax delinquency and foreclosure. So some of the how properties came to be vacant. Buildings department should have a dangerous buildings list, a list of code violations. They also may have information on tenure type if they have a rental registry. Then your deed recorder will have information on foreclosures, again, tax and mortgage typically. Utility providers can be a great source of information. For water, gas, electricity, both cutoffs, but importantly, drops in usage. So sometimes these entities are private or public, depending on where you're at. But utility providers and some of the tax information is important when we're trying to predict where vacancy will be emerging. Then finally, police and fire departments. Sometimes fire departments will track and record where there are dangerous buildings, so they can be a source of information that's sometimes overlooked. They will also have information, obviously, about arson. So many communities have actually initiated their own primary data collection through parcel surveys, either to fill gaps in data sources or to address some of the inaccuracy in other data sources. These are windshield, so it's usually just exterior only. and it collects information on parcel vacancy, parcel condition, structure vacancy, structure condition, but also unique sort of condition issues. So open points of entry, peeling paint, unsound porch or garage, if there's a roof issue. Importantly, many of them typically collect photos, and I'll show you an example of one of these in a moment. Couple of notes quickly. I won't go all into property surveys, though I'm happy to answer questions at the end, but try to survey all parcels in your community. Sometimes communities will want to just do the vacant properties or just residential. If you can, you're already out in the field, try and incentivize collecting information for all parcels. Technology has greatly increased the efficiency, both from a time and cost standpoint of surveying. So there are providers right now that will provide you with an app that you can use on a smartphone to both log information and take a photo and map all of that information automatically. This is a far cry from my first survey experience, which was pen and paper, physical map, and taking, I at least had a digital camera though, taking that to Kinko's to get my photos printed. Another note on surveys, they're a great partnership opportunity. So it also serves typically as the launch pad, the first thing for a broader vacancy or problem property approach or strategy in a community. Corporations can donate technology, hardware. They are also a good source of volunteers. Academic institutions can provide mapping, also data and information warehousing. CBOs are excellent to give sort of on the ground knowledge about what's going on with properties. In terms of national data sources, USPS collects data on vacancy and all addresses. Importantly, both for residential and business. This is issued on a quarterly basis, which anybody can access. However, it's aggregated. So USPS won't tell you which specific address, but they will say for this part of the neighborhood, here's what vacancy looks like. There are other providers, Loveland Technology, I have the URL there, which will sell at a price this information at the parcel level. Census and ACS has information on housing vacancy and housing condition issues. The difference between the two has to do with sort of frequency of data collection. Next question for you guys, I think I know the answer to this, but I thought I'd ask nonetheless, is whether or not you think your community has a map of neighborhood market conditions. Yes, no, not really sure. Give you one more second. Okay. So what it looks like is we don't know, which again is great. I'll give you guys a couple of resources to take a look at. I was expecting, given the realtor audience, that some of you would probably say yes. Glad to see that. And same with the no's. Hopefully I can show you a couple of sources to take a look at, a couple of questions. So for market conditions, we're trying to answer a couple of big questions. One, how well is the market working? So we need data on sales volume, how quickly properties sell, what they're selling for, how they're sold, if it's financing or cash purchases, who's buying those properties. But we also should take a look at what's affecting the market. So is crime high? What's going on with population? Are household types changing across an area? Are jobs leaving? Are more coming? Also importantly, and this is one that's frequently left off sort of market and general sort of indicator analyses, is who is most negatively impacted by problem properties generally or by market change. So this is looking at the environment in which these properties reside or the markets generally. Importantly, I encourage communities to take a look at race and also income. What we see is in areas where you're either experiencing a market upswing, or maybe you're just before an upswing, or in areas where you're experiencing continued market decline. Those changes, whether sort of quote unquote positive or negative, tend to adversely impact specific population groups, specifically populations of color and low-income communities. So as we consider different strategies or tools to apply in a community, we want to make sure that we're keeping an eye of where vulnerable populations may exist and how our decisions may impact them. So as with vacancy, we want to look at how things are changing over time, and also spatial patterns generally. So is vacancy decreasing, for example, in areas where properties are selling? Yes or no? How do those line up? And then examining market types. So I'll show you an example of this really quickly, but what we encourage communities to do is not sort of just look at individual maps or points of data, but to try and aggregate those together in a market index. What that's helpful for is to understand how many different indicators may interact with one another and which areas may have similarities. Then finally, as I mentioned, we will want to examine equity threats. So are specific populations being more impacted currently, or will they be by our future decisions? Data sets here. So again, deeds data is invaluable. I'll pause for a moment there and talk about MLS given the audience. So MLS is excellent. Certainly listing prices, sales volume, sales type. Importantly, days on market. As I'm sure you guys know, that is a pretty unique element for MLS. It's not found in other data sources. So that is one that I know I will typically look at when I'm accessing MLS data with a community. So the shortcoming though of MLS is not all transactions, as you guys know, are on MLS. That is why we need additional data like from your register or recorder of deeds. They'll have sort of more of the universe, if you will, of transactions occurring and what those look like. Tax assessor data, property values and ownership, that's pretty obvious. Building departments, important to understand where code violations are happening because that's an indicator rather, of general investment in an area. Rental properties, permitting data, also important. That's usually an early indicator of a market upswing. Police information is important, obviously, for crime and crime hotspots. Looking for a moment at the national data sets. So census data, ACS data, hugely important to understand sort of population trends, information on housing tenure, household type and size. On the map is important if we want to look and understand more about who's working in a community. So it's information on jobs and industries, worker characteristics, but importantly and uniquely job flows. So it will show you within a census tracker block group, which is a small increment of area in a community, within that area, how many people are coming into that area to work, how many people live in that area but have to leave to work, and how many both live and work within an area. And via that web link, you can access all of that through an already sort of mapped portal. HMDA data, I'm sure you guys are familiar with, so you can get information on loan volume, loan amount, denials, importantly, borrower characteristics, looking at age, race, and income. Finally, FBI crime reporting data. This is not as great as local data, both in terms of how you can get the data and sort of the granularity of the data. So I encourage you to work with your local police departments. If that's not possible for whatever reason, UCR data is accessible and is helpful. Finally, this will be my last poll, and then I'll just pop up a couple of examples. Wanted to know sort of the status of this last question that we need to ask ourselves, which is, what is the future land use vision of the community? So does the community that you serve have a future land use vision? Yes, no, don't know. Give you another second. Okay. The vast majority, unsurprisingly, said yes, which is great. I have a follow-up question to those yeses. Small amount said no. Some people said didn't know, which is fine. I'll give you an idea of where to look for that. So I lied. This is my last poll. This is my last question, sort of a follow-up to that, which is, if your community does have a future land use vision, do you like it? Do you believe in it? Do you think it's the right path forward for your community? And I gave you a couple of answers, which is like, yes, meh, which is my, it's neither yes nor no, basically. No, or don't know. I have never looked at it. I know we have one, not sure. Give you guys another couple of seconds. Okay. So our final poll today. It looks like we're in the middle for a lot of individuals. For those individuals, I have a couple of sort of key strategic questions you can ask about your future land use vision. The yeses, excellent. Love to see that as a planner myself. For the no's or not sure, don't know, haven't looked at it, I'll also give you guys a couple of questions. So let me, I guess, start at the bottom on this one. It's pretty simple about where to look in data sources. It should be readily accessible from your local planning department or planning commission or sort of planning entity. They're always called something different depending on your location. There should be a couple of things you can access to get this. Certainly the zoning, but also the plan for the community. Again, depending on where you're at, it may be called a comprehensive plan, master plan, general plan. There's also, again, language may differ, but future land use visions or framework document. I know I'm using the term in my discussion here, future land use vision. It's really just intended to encompass a number of different facets. But where you see sort of a vision or framework is when you have not yet as a community sort of codified some of that future vision. So maybe you're in the process, for example, of updating your master plan. Or you've updated your master plan, but you've not yet updated your zoning code. So sometimes they'll refer to a document that's sort of a process step to get you there. But regardless of what it's called or how it's codified in your community, hopefully that can answer these questions. So what types of job and industry do we want to grow and where? What type of housing and neighborhood should the area foster? How will people move around our community? How will people get to jobs, housing, and other amenities? How can we improve health and safety? How will our community become more resilient? So I'm talking about economic resiliency, social and environmental resiliency, and ultimately, what will our value proposition be to a business or resident? What will be our competitive advantage? Why should, in the future and now, a resident or business choose to reinvest in their property or locate in our community? So even though your community, and it sounded like the vast majority of those of us on the call, our community has a future land use plan, what I found in my experience, particularly in communities that have vacancy and property deterioration, is that vision doesn't address all of these questions really sufficiently. And specifically, I'll call out those last two. So particularly in places that have had population loss, when I take a look at their vision, sometimes what I find is their ultimate vision for the community really is just to rebuild the past. Like the goal is let's get the population back to where it was and let's rebuild physically the community the same way it was in the 40s. Their future land use vision depicts sort of an antiquated vision generally of low density sort of Euclidean land uses. So that's where you have sort of one option for housing, which may be a single family detached house where a person needs to drive to access basic goods and services, and jobs are restricted in this other area of a community. And this vision typically is really light on natural and open spaces and tends to, because of the separation and low density of uses, perpetuate some development patterns that tend to exacerbate environmental or climate threats. So yeah, they might have a land use vision, but it's the wrong vision. And my commentary there is, it's not to say that every place needs to be sort of high-rise mixed use, but communities must offer options for businesses and residents. And a vision that's built around sort of one industry or only one housing type, it's gonna fail. Communities need options so that as economies and consumer preferences shift, it can accommodate those shifts. And it also needs to ensure that different types of people and businesses can thrive there. And then finally, it needs to examine how it can better use its land to be more resilient to environmental changes and to be generally more sustainable from an economic standpoint. So I'd say that if your community's vision sort of falls short of being able to answer some of those questions, as realtors, you guys are an excellent source of information to help local government and your community update that vision, to better understand where demand is at now, and most importantly, where it's going for the future, and how the supply of properties in a community can better respond and accommodate that vision. I am about at time. Here's what I'm going to do. Veronica, and also Jen, if you guys will give me, I just need about 5 more minutes. I wanted to pop on a couple of examples of places that have done these things. Veronica will share a little bit about her experience with some communities, both on the tactics standpoint, but also on the sort of the application of tactics. Here, what I wanted to do was show a couple of quick maps. So this is one example of a parcel survey. This is done in Detroit. Here you can see in sort of an easy mapped format, I can look at unoccupied properties that are in poor or fair condition. Hopefully this will pop on. If not, I'll just jump out. But basically what you'd be able to see is these individual parcels pop on. Oh, because I didn't press apply. There we go. While that's thinking, I'll just show you a quick result from that map. So I was mentioning that the use of photos can be helpful. You can see the information below about this parcel. Yes, there's a structure on the parcel, but it's unoccupied. The condition's poor, and yes, there's fire damage. And the fire severity is major. So in Detroit, which is where this property survey was done, that was the type of information they were able to collect. I mentioned photos because importantly for this property, you can see in 2014, it was actually in good condition. Clearly something very dramatic happened because in about a year, it then looked like this. That dramatic thing obviously was a fire, but it's important to have an understanding of that change in real time. Mapping vehicles and surveys can be one tool to do that. This, by the way, it just took a minute for it to think. Here's a community through that survey where they were able to show all the unoccupied properties in fair or poor condition. Looking at Flint, this is another, I'm just showing you examples of what communities have done where they're able to display property conditions. So the green are vacant lots, and also substandard properties are in the red, and then good properties are in the blue. They also provided an opportunity for their community to look at that same map and understand what that future land use is. So you can see in this area, it's primarily green neighborhood, which is residential that has a larger parcel footprint. So you got more land, along with a mixed residential community up there. This is an example of a market indicator. So that market index that I was referencing, this is from New Orleans. They looked at multiple indicators. So vacancy, for example, foreclosure, code violation. And then they looked at where across their city did we seem to have markets with similar indicators. And that's what this ends up looking like. They used this market information to inform a multitude of decision points, but one of them, for example, is as a property goes through foreclosure, the output of that is one of two things. Code lien foreclosure would be resulting in either demolition or a sale of that structure to the private market. Using information about the current market conditions, in addition to parcel information about that condition, it helped them make better decisions on when to sell to the private market versus when to just demolish it. They also took a look in an updated version about displacement risk. So these are the areas where there is stronger likelihood and an increase in risk for displacement. So in the areas that are shaded yellow, for example, these are markets that have not yet sort of emerged, but where there is an active threat to potential displacement. So this may be an area where you're looking to preserve existing home ownership for residents. Chicago has done a similar initiative that is looking at displacement pressure. And then the final one really quickly is Youngstown. So Youngstown is an area where they, through a mapping interface and a variety of surveys, you can see the individual parcels are vacancy. The shaded areas are their market information. And with that, those combinations, they determined how they should prioritize neighborhood planning efforts in activities for demolition, acquisition, and disposition. So those are examples of the different places that have employed either a survey tool or a market index. Policy map, I'm just showing you really quickly, and let's see here. I don't think it'll display as I'm walking through, it'll take a second. So I'll just mention Policy Map is a data aggregator tool. What it allows you to do is pop on different data layers. You don't need sort of a mapping background to do this. It has data on housing, so housing location, home values, rents. It also has information on vacancy, in addition to information on income, demographics, overall sort of quality of life, crime data, economy. They also have added information on COVID. So where you have COVID cases, COVID deaths, and indicators where COVID may be a larger threat. Then a final note about Policy Map is you can upload your own data set. So there are tools to sort of process and gather information relatively swiftly, depending on sort of where your community is at. With that, I've eaten into some of our final Q&A time, but before we switch there, I wanted to hand it over to you, Veronica, to talk a bit about your experiences.
Sure, I appreciate it. Give me 1 second. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Veronica Cardello, the Southwest Political Field Representative for the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors. And today I'm excited to present to you about our Transforming Neighborhoods seminar. In June of 2019, the Realtors Association of Westmoreland, Indiana and Mon Valley developed a collaborative effort with the Westmoreland and Indiana County Planning and Development offices, the Center for Community Progress, and the National Association of Realtors to present our very first Transforming Neighborhoods seminar. This seminar was comprised of over 60 Realtor members, community leaders from local governments, as you can see in the photo to the right. The goal of the seminar was to engage the different government entities and nonprofits with our Realtor members in order to educate and share the different perspectives that we could all bring to the table. Prior to the seminar, our relationship with code officials and local councils was not the greatest. As a result of the seminar, we have cultivated relationships that we had only dreamed of. As a follow-up to our seminar, we met with individual partners to collaborate even further. These partners included local governments, county governments, nonprofits, and for-profits. We developed a strategic plan to assist in our efforts to grow our communities by focusing on 3 different facets. The first facet was community engagement and education. The second facet was investor involvement in opportunity zones. And our third facet was blight concerns and beautification projects. To do this, our initiative intertwines with the plans already in place, such as the Westmoreland County Comprehensive Plan and the Sustainable Indiana Program. Our first facet lays out our desired outcomes and action plan. In our desired outcomes, we knew we wanted to have a heavy focus on local governments, including the county commissioners, state elected officials, and most importantly, our community leaders. We understand that community leaders are not just elected, but can be those who are most actively involved throughout the counties we service. Our action plan was tailored toward education, since this was a new initiative for all those involved. It was going to be a tough sell, not only for our association, but also the community leaders who were focused on their niche in the community. Our second facet was timed to the deadlines of the opportunity zones. So we knew that we needed to increase the knowledge behind why investor involvement was so important. Our desired outcomes were to have more realtors specialized in opportunity zones, while our action plan was to host another Transforming Neighborhood seminar that would not only increase the knowledge base, but also lead to the end goal of hosting commercial open houses for all the potential investment properties in either county. Our third facet channeled on all the concerns that every member had with regards to blight. Our desired outcomes would have impacted 2 separate areas within Westmoreland and Indiana counties. However, we were met with a challenge when the previous executive director left the redevelopment authority in Westmoreland County. So we had to focus our action plan, which allowed us to grow our partnership with the city of Greensburg, developing a comprehensive housing plan for blighted properties. In Lawrence County, the city of Newcastle was experiencing blight through a separate lens. In Greensburg, we focused on the educational aspect of blight, while in Newcastle, we needed to focus on the implementation stages. In 2017, the city proposed a vacant property ordinance that would have allowed homeowners to be fined $10,000 for every residential property not sold within 180 days, and a commercial property $65,000 within the same time frame. The average days on market were 245. This controversial ordinance provoked a lot of opposition, not only from the realtors, but from outside organizations as well. As shocking as these numbers were, my realtors knew we needed to step in. In an 8-month time frame, we were able to convince the city to put together a blight task force. Through the work of the task force, over 20 different organizations, such as the Lawrence County Board of Realtors, Blueprint Communities, Disability Options Network, also known as DAWN, and community members met to provide a different approach to blight. Throughout the process, the task force became more engaged with community members, learning about the variety of efforts other organizations were contributing to the myriad of problems the city had faced. When the Blight Task Force presented recommendations to the city, they did not have the funding necessary to begin these efforts. We knew we needed an anchor organization in the community, so Dawn stepped up and began spearheading revitalization projects in the Lower East Side neighborhood. This timeline shows you the gap between when the city took on their own version of revitalization efforts and when outside organizations previously mentioned became involved. From 2002 to 2014, as you can see, there was stagnant progress. Since 2017, we have successfully concentrated on implementing our desired plans for the city for homeowners. None of this would have been possible without having an anchor organization and the cooperation of multiple other organizations to apply for a variety of funding through their resources. The power that our organizations had in changing the homeownership front was absolutely incredible. On the left, you can see a map of the targeted neighborhood known as the Lower East Side. On the right, you can see the before and after photos of the blighted home that we transformed as a result of our efforts. This area was targeted due to the significant amount of blighted properties originally identified by the city. Also in this neighborhood, we have successfully built 3 community gardens from various vacant lots that the neighbors have taken pride in taking over. Our efforts provided the blueprint while the community membership took ownership in leading the projects. Revitalization is still possible in this COVID-19 era. In the city of Greensburg, we have held Zoom meetings and conference calls to create more partnerships by reaching out to the local colleges and universities to include their vision for city life. The city is also working with us to implement the county comprehensive plan and develop a citywide plan for housing initiatives. In the city of Newcastle, we have a stronger relationship with our newly elected mayor and city council. The mayor has issued an exploratory task force to consider home rule as its new government form. Additionally, we are gearing up for our 3rd round of funding through the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh. Some key takeaways for success include relationship building within and outside of our association, thinking outside the box. There were countless times our association was told that our plans would never work, and we continue to push through those barriers. Collaboration. It takes more than one organization to pool their resources together to achieve the desired results that you need for your communities. And most importantly, realtor involvement. Adrienne Abe Wagner is one of my first mentors within the Realtors Association. She has always told me that we are the heart of our communities, and without the heart, we have no beat. So we have no excuse not to be involved. When you believe in a powerful mantra like this, anything is possible. Thank you. I think we're ready for Q&A.
Liz, are there any individuals that had raised their hand through Zoom? Otherwise, I saw through the chat there were a couple of questions that came in, which I can try and field.
Yeah, we don't have any hand raises right now, so if you want to address the question and answer box, and would just encourage folks, if they're interested in asking a question, raise your hand or feel free to put it through the question and answer box and we'll address them. Thanks.
So there are a couple of comments and a couple of questions. I guess let me start with the questions first. An individual had said that their city claims to have a map of problem properties, but doesn't publicize it, nor do they publicize properties that are city owned and could be infilled or repurposed. And they were interested in understanding sort of what tips may we have on urging city government to share this data with the community. So I've heard this in a few different communities that, you know, we can't get at, we don't know what they own. Particularly, I'm talking on public property ownership, and they won't tell us. So, you know, either I have a property that's adjacent to one of these and I want to get access to it, but, you know, I'm not sure who owns it or what the process is, or, you know, the city or land bank may own a number of properties in my area, and I have no idea what's going to be happening with them. In terms of what may be going, I can't, you know, obviously I can't comment on the local specifics there, but some rationales I've heard in the past from public governments or public entities, whether those be sort of cities or land banks holding those properties, is they're usually concerned when they have a large development that's coming and they're trying to still do strategic acquisition. Maybe, again, that's putting in a greenway and they're concerned that they've not yet done full site assembly and they want to get access to a couple of final properties through strategic acquisition, and they're concerned if they sort of publicize a lot about what they're doing, that will inhibit their ability to finish their assemblage. My experience has been that regardless of what the reason is, it doesn't bode well for trust. And it does more harm than whatever perceived good that they had in mind. So what I would encourage you to do certainly is reach out, which I'm assuming you have, to your city officials. Make it clear why you're asking though. There may be a concern if a realtor is asking for it that they're somehow trying to get access to the property, or I have no clue. But ultimately, I imagine your interest is just trying to understand what's going on in an area and what's going to happen with these properties, and emphasizing the need to share that information with the community. So if you are, as a public entity, trying to assemble properties, just say that. Say you're trying to assemble properties. That's why there's a bit of a silent nature to this area, and at least involve key community leaders in those decisions. Final note would be, if it's a public entity, you have access to public information. So you can go the FOIA route. That's a little bit adversarial. I would just emphasize why you're asking and why it's important for the government to share that information, that you're coming at this from a perspective to what Veronica was saying. You know, realtors are the community, are part of this community, want to foster community improvement. That's why. And you know, if they need some sort of special data agreement, then you can do that. But simply not sharing information, one, is not really an option because you're a public entity, but two, just fosters distrust between all parties. So emphasizing what you want to do with it is important. I suppose, you know, other strategies would be trying to figure out where your stopping point is. So for arguments, say it's the head of your buildings department. There are individuals above the head of the buildings department. So trying to put pressure on your elected officials, mayor, city council, et cetera, to try and open up those paths has been effective in finding who they trust or will listen to. So I know when I, for example, was working with a CBO, you know, we weren't pulling much political weight, but we were able to get our major local employers on board and have sort of a collaborative push to try and open up channels to information. So those are a couple of thoughts, not knowing sort of the specific dynamics of your community. Veronica, I'm interested if you ran into any of those challenges or have any additional thoughts there too.
We ran into a lot of challenges. It depended on the community that we were in. So I service 6 different associations, and within those 6 associations, it's 10 counties. And everyone that we had an encounter with, it was more territorial, if that makes sense. So they were reluctant to share information with us because they didn't really understand what the Realtors Association had to bring to the table. And once we were able to provide information for them, like data analytics from RPR and other things like that, it completely changed the tone. So when the city was applying for different grants, or if there was a different municipality or borough that was applying for something particular, we were able to help and be a resource. So once we provided that resource, it really opened the gateway to the city.
Another question here that did sort of just come in during our Q&A is an individual is looking to incentivize investment from private funds. The comment is that cities too frequently default to sort of nonprofit everything, but that sort of distorts the market and guarantees ongoing government involvement. So asking what programs allow or incentivize private developers to find it worthwhile to invest in a property or in the area to benefit it all. I do have a couple of thoughts there. Veronica, wanted to defer to you if this has come up, sort of how to encourage and sort of have a positive attitude about the inclusion of the private market, not simply defaulting to full government subsidies specifically for nonprofit development.
Absolutely. So in my presentation, we mentioned opportunity zones, and we've been able to take advantage at full force of the opportunity zones here in Western Pennsylvania. So an opportunity zone is a government, it's our government, our federal government giving a tax credit to those who are going to develop in that area. And for private developers, it works for them tenfold because I do believe it's 5 years, 5 to 10 years that you're able to get that tax credit. So we've been really focused on that angle in my area particularly, but for local governments, we've also helped devise different incentives for private development. And we really want that public-private partnership to thrive.
A couple of other thoughts for you as well. I will say it is sort of one of my beefs, if you will, with how government tend to approach property revitalization sort of generally. There's a default position to exclude sort of private investors and the private market and only go, as your comment notes, sort of the nonprofit route. I don't think either one really works. It needs to be a combination of both, but a note on nonprofits, the community development landscape from a nonprofit standpoint is really varied. There are a number of communities where you simply don't have effective, efficient nonprofit developers. You must, if you want to do rehabilitation, must engage private developers. Another sort of issue I have is also exclusion of landlords or rental properties from any incentive. Yes, homeownership is positive from an individual wealth creation standpoint, also important to facilitate stability in neighborhood markets. However, there's also a role to play for landlords. And typically some of the benefits that you see are excluding that segment of the population, which does provide a housing need. So both on sort of general private market developers and also sort of looking at other types of property owners like landlords. What I encourage a community to do is sort of a couple of things. One, understand why the default to always homeownership or always nonprofit exists. Sometimes it's just based on a lack of understanding of how markets work or what the local ecosystem is. So being able to provide your government entity with an understanding of, okay, you have this many affordable housing units that are in good condition. You need this many. The existing nonprofit capacity can only enter in, let's say, 3 units per year. You're never going to get to your overarching goal without the private sector. So just sort of laying out information of where there are market gaps and the specific and unique role that the private market can play in helping them to address their overarching goal is important. I would say if their concern is that we want to foster lasting housing affordability, just sticking with housing for the moment, being a partner with them and exploring opportunities to ensure lasting housing affordability. So if a government does provide a subsidy to private development, making sure a certain percentage of those units are affordable in a lasting manner is a tactic many use, either through like inclusionary zoning or how they use their subsidies and grants So really focusing less on sort of which actor, more on what is the community's goal, what is that government official's goal, and trying to articulate how you can achieve that is helpful. Again, there are other tools and techniques. It really does just depend though on what your market looks like. But oftentimes what I'm finding is it's just a lack of understanding of how markets work and how they can safeguard against some of their concerns of unintended consequences. Liz, I will just point out, did mention that there were a number of questions about access to slides. So she did just chat everybody about access to the slides, because I do have hyperlinks, I know, in a lot of mine, and some of the websites it really quickly sort of just flashed on. I will also embed in the deck so you can access that as well. Final note just on the slide deck changes. CCP has a number of publications going more in depth on some of these tools, so I'll include access to those as well. We also have a couple of COVID related items that you may find interesting. All right, back to questions. So there was a question about whether or not community members, so members and leaders of the communities, if they've been engaged sort of in this discussion, and if so, what role did they play? Veronica, I'll let you sort of answer that first, and I'll follow up if I have any additional thoughts.
Sure. The community, well, it depends. Again, it's really situational and it depends on your area. But for us, particularly, government entities played a large role because they had access to different resources than what a nonprofit or a for-profit would. And so when we realized that, that's whenever we had to develop that mindset of we have to come together, and this is the vision that we see for these different communities. And so we're engaging in those conversations daily, if not, hourly, to see what our visions are really going to be for the particular areas that we service. Now, I mentioned the city of Greensburg and I mentioned the city of Newcastle. The city of Newcastle, again, is more far advanced, and they're more far advanced because we had that anchor organization that was able to say, hey, we need to actually show results. We don't want another plan that's just going to sit on the shelf. So they were able to come up with the funding, and with the help of other organizations, have that roadmap for the city. So now the city can begin their revitalization programming.
A couple other sort of just broad thoughts about community engagement. It is absolutely vital. Community progress largely works with governmental entities, and it doesn't matter sort of what piece of technical assistance we're doing. We almost always identify that community engagement is sort of lacking in the process. When I say community engagement, I mean both resident and also business leader engagement. There's a tendency, again, depending on which program, to sort of default to resident only. Business leaders need to be included, even if you're only looking at residential vacancy, because access to the businesses around a neighborhood, trying to attract businesses to a neighborhood for sort of neighborhood scaled commercial, it's vital that you get their input. So a couple notes there, but also realtors. I am always astounded when I talk with governmental officials and I ask them about sort of how's the market doing, and I ask, well, what's the partnership look like with realtors? Frequently I'll get the, well, I don't know exactly who to contact. So I would say that if you are interested in sort of engaging in these topic areas with your local government, please proactively reach out. Oftentimes what I hear is it's not sort of a lack of willingness, it's just sort of not really knowing who to ask or where to go. And realtors, like residents, are such a critical source of information about what's going on in a neighborhood. All of those data sources I was clicking through, they're flawed. Many of them are lagging. Realtors, residents, business leaders know what's happening in their neighborhood now and understand where it's going. So engagement in understanding from a resident standpoint, specifically what the conditions of a property are, which ones are particularly problematic, so extreme sort of health and safety threats, but also where that community and those residents would like to see sort of that vision go, as Veronica was mentioning. Couple of other just thoughts, probably less so questions. One, an individual pointed out that in their community, there's currently a proposal to tax properties that are vacant for 180 days. And it looks like it's going to pass. The comment didn't really have a sort of yay or nay to it. But generally what you're referencing is probably structured somewhat as a VPRO, or vacant property registration ordinance, which requires, it plays out differently, and Veronica mentioned one approach to doing it. Usually it's sort of a minimum, you have to tell us who is owning and a local agent who's managing a vacant property. There's typically at least some sentence or request to tell us what you're gonna do about the vacancy. The goal there is less so on sort of a punitive measure for vacancy, more so on just make sure that the government knows who to contact. And so we have a better sense of where vacancy is at. Second part of it is more on the enforcement end, which is particularly in markets that are hot, where you see investors sort of sitting on properties, and we need to sort of have those properties enter back into active use. You'll see governments attach fines and fees based on duration of vacancy and whether or not you stuck to your plan to reoccupy. So it's a fairly common tool. I will say the way that it's applied drastically varies, and intentionally so, because some of those tactics won't work depending on your market conditions. The webinar that'll be on code enforcement will go a little bit more, I imagine, into VPROs and also rental regulation and how those tools can be used more effectively too.
Danielle, can I pitch out 2 questions that are coming in through our question and answer box as the last question?
Oh, sure, yes, thank you, sorry.
Okay, so the first one is, who typically develops the list of problem properties? Is it coming from the city, the county, or an outside entity?
Yes, the answer is it varies. So in theory, it would be your local municipality, whether that's your city, township, etc. County level governments do it typically in more rural places. If we're talking about a metro area, it's such a massive undertaking, and the tools like building and codes are housed locally. That's where you need to start first. However, also other entities, either because a government is under-resourced or uninterested, you see private entities filling this gap, because that information of where vacancy is at, what condition it is in, is information that's hugely valuable well beyond the government, which is why it's such a nice partnership opportunity. So we'll see academic institutions leading it and doing it on their own, sometimes without government partnership, because the government doesn't care to partner. We'll see private corporations partner with academic institutions to answer some of these questions. We'll also see nonprofits or CDFIs activate. So the answer is, it depends. Ideally, there's government involvement, because ultimately it will fall upon the government to do something about it. But absent sort of government leadership and capacity, we've seen very successful efforts, often more successful when it is coming from community organizations or other sort of private collaboratives.
Great. This is going to be our last question of the session today, and it's for you, Veronica. How did the Realtors Association get involved with the Blight Task Force, and what's your advice to ensure that government embraces the ideas that realtors want to be at the table?
So that's a great question. So we actually had to brand ourselves. So when we first met with the city officials and like the mayor, we were not well branded, and they had no idea what a realtor, like why a realtor would want to be involved in this conversation. So we tactfully rebranded ourselves for the city using market data. So we made ourselves the experts. And when we made ourselves the experts, we ensured 2 spots on the task force. And it was a beautiful marriage, quite honestly. So.
All right. Thank you, Danielle and Veronica, for this information, resources, and examples that you shared with us today. And thank you all for your participation. We know that there are lots of other things you could be doing, and this is a very busy time. So we appreciate you giving us some of your afternoon. And we hope that you'll join us on August 25th for the second webinar in our series. And that's the one that's going to focus on code enforcement. So we'll look at how it can be used as a tool for preventing vacancy and abandonment. We look forward to seeing you. We hope you enjoyed it, and please do tell your colleagues to register and check out the rest of our webinar series. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.